Unit 10 started off with us being presented with 5 different questions and being told to complete one of them. The 5 questions were: should you trust Wikipedia? How can you avoid internet scams? Should you believe that rumor? How can you detect social media bots? And should you click on or forward that link to gossip? I decided to engage with the 5th and final question: should you click on or forward that link to gossip? This meant that I had to watch a TED Talk from Sally Cohn from 2014 titled "Don't Like Clickbait, Don't Click." We also watched a TED Talk from Monica Lewinsky from 2015 titled "The Price of Shame." The first TED Talk by Sally Cohn talks about why it's important that we don't click on links that we see in our social media apps if they're like related to things that we don't want to see. So for example, she talks about how a lot of people feel like in the modern day there's kind of been this takeover of more of like a rude and like perverse culture online. But what she points out is that, these things will become more common because we click on these things and we engage with our thing, like these things, which like generates views, and it kind of tells like the certain like social media app that we're using that this kind of content is engaging, which makes it more likely to pop up in our feeds. It makes it more likely to be posted because people are engaging with it. And she's basically just pointing out that like it's kind of hypocritical how we talk about we don't like this kind of thing and we don't want to see it, and yet we always sort of create an audience for it, and how it's important that if we really do want to stop clickbait, then we should just not click on stuff in the first place. And then the second TED Talk by Monica Lewinsky was about her giving a more personal kind of look at her own life. She sort of went back to the whole scandal between her and Bill Clinton, and how that kind of affected her life after the whole scandal was found out, and she was kind of turned into this sort of public enemy because a lot of people felt like she was kind of corrupting, I guess, the president or like the nation in a sense, and they all kind of vilified her and like made her into this big demon. And she talks about how even now, like years later, it still follows her, and she's still seen as like this kind of person who, like, I guess, really had this negative effect on this one era in history. She talks about how she really fell into this negative kind of pit where everyone was just kind of looking down on her, and she felt like she was just hated by everyone. And she talks about, like how nice it would have been if there had been less hate coming her way, and if we had engaged with less content that was kind of related towards putting her down, and if basically people had just been willing to almost like ignore her or let her be and live her own life rather than like showing her all this cruelty. Um, but basically, both of these TED Talks do a good job of kind of going back to answer the question of should you click on or forward that link to gossip. They both really kind of create this emotional appeal where they talk about like when we share these links and we click on these things that have like these kind of attacks towards certain people, it does affect them. Even if maybe we're not talking to those people or we don't like send it to that person, just the way that it all feeds into like this algorithm, and it kind of creates this like bigger cloud of negativity that affects them, definitely still like goes back to them, which is why if we want to try and be good about stuff like that, we have to make sure that we're not really like engaging with that content in the first place. For this particular assignment, we were supposed to frame our kind of response to this question as like a message to someone that we knew. So I messaged my friend J.E., and I pretended to kind of talk to them about what I just said, basically about why, we have to be careful with links that relate to drama and like bad stories, just because these things can kind of indirectly go back and affect these people in ways that maybe we don't originally think. That was everything I had for assignment number 1, though, so it was time to move on. Assignment number 2 had a similar kind of setup. There was a great list of articles to look at, and then we were supposed to choose one to focus on. These articles had a shared theme where they kind of discussed decision making on the internet. I decided to look at the 10th article written by Menon called "Do Online Reviews Diminish Physician Authority? The Case of Cosmetic Surgery in the United States." This study sought to determine whether online reviews of physicians from patients reduced the amount of authority that physicians had. The person conducting the study had learned that many physicians felt they were losing credibility as reviews began to be written online that sometimes gave less than stellar like feedback or kind of critiques of the business. They felt that as their scores went down, they started to receive less inquiries from potential customers. What the study ended up finding was that most reviews were actually positive and made people feel better about their physicians, but that regardless, physicians were nervous about the reviews, believing that they took away some of their autonomy or their authority. It makes sense to me that people would rate their physicians positively, as most physicians are very capable and they're able to do their jobs. They undergo a lot of training, they receive a lot of education, so it makes sense that they would be able to perform at like a preferable level. It also makes sense to me that physicians wouldn't like the idea of being as like graded, you could say, by their patients, though. It would be kind of stressful if every single time like a patient came in and you think about how you might be dealing with dozens a day, but if every single time potentially each individual one could be like a risk of you like losing your job, even if maybe you do perform at like a decent enough level, maybe it's not what they wanted, and at the end of the day that could be enough for them to kind of fight against you and sort of put your name in a bad light in the public space. I can't personally say that I have much personal experience when it comes to any kind of plastic surgery. I don't know. I don't think anyone in my life who's had plastic surgery, or if I do, I guess they haven't told me. um, but I mean, I will occasionally leave reviews for things on the internet, and I think the average person is probably more likely to speak up and say something online if it is like a negative experience. So I understand why that kind of bias would be concerning from like a physician's perspective. But I would say that I generally don't leave reviews. But when I do, I try to make it a good mix of positive and negatives. But I mean, I try never to say anything like horrible about like a business or anything either, unless like it is like very, very like suboptimal performance, and I feel like it's worth reporting about, it's worth telling someone else about, then I'll make sure to say something. But generally, I don't that often. And I don't think I know too many people who do either. I know every now and then they will, but most often it feels like you're referencing things that you've heard from other people to try and make your own decisions. That was everything I had for assignment number 2, though. I made that all into my post, and I talked about how like the study was kind of unique, and why physicians feel the way I do. And I sympathize with them, I do. I think it could be tough to potentially be at risk of, getting in trouble for doing your job if maybe it's not being done the way that someone else wants it to, but maybe it's the way that you think it should be done. So I know that can be tough. And plastic surgery also has to be a hard field to work in, because I imagine that the consequences are a lot greater, and people have really great expectations for things, and sometimes I imagine it could be hard to meet those expectations. So I sympathize with those doctors, I do. But anyways, that's everything for assignment number 2. Moving into assignment number 3, I started off by reading all the posts written by my other members of my class. And then I tried to find 2 different comments that were made. I tried to find a comment by a classmate who read a similar article to me for assignment number 1, and then I tried to find a comment from a classmate who read a different article from me. Fortunately, I was able to find a post that was made by a classmate who also read the Monica Lewinsky article and the Sally Cohn, or I should say watched the TED Talks, not an article. And she did a good job of kind of pretending to talk to this other person, talking about how they should be careful, similarly to what I said about like sharing kind of information about celebrities or spreading gossip or just kind of anything like that, because there is a danger that comes with clicking on links, and sharing them to other people who also click on those links, because ultimately that does kind of create this cultural issue, and it does create this bigger and bigger sort of cloud and this kind of push to feed people negative information and to really just bring people down. And I like how the person who posted this, Amelia, did a good job of kind of explaining the negative effects of, feeding into this whole cycle. She also does a good job of kind of being empathetic with the person that she's pretending to talk to. I know sometimes when we see someone doing it on the internet that we don't consider it to be like a good thing to do, it's easy to kind of be like condescending or talk down to them or focus on like being corrective. But Amelia does a good job of being like, I know you feel this way and I understand, but I just think, just kind of being more like kind and gentle about it. And then I also just thought like it was worth commenting on the actual way she explained the content in the TED Talks, because having watched them myself, I could say that, I found her explanations to be well done, because she did a good job of kind of explaining like the technological side of how clicks feed into sort of the algorithm, but also like the kind of ethical, moral like positivity side of trying not to put that on people and like being more positive. She did a good job of covering both sides, so I wanted to comment on that too and just say that that was kind of a bit of an awkward split almost, but that it was well done the way that she commented. For my next comment, I looked to a post that was made by Genesis, and in her comment, she talks about how she actually learned recently about some internet scams and how to avoid them. She talks about an article that she read that talked about a kids toy company called Little Tykes and how apparently there was a decent amount of websites that actually like mimicked their original website, and they would kind of take in orders for products, but they would never send anything out. So they were just accepting all this money, pretending to be this company that they weren't. And her kind of takeaway was to be careful about trusting these sites where it seems like they sell kind of like products that are like too cheap or too good to be true. And then she talks about a second article as well, also dealing with internet scams. And she talks about how it's important to not automatically trust customer service numbers that are provided directly by Google. You know how sometimes when you like look up a certain product or a certain company, Google might automatically give you like a number to dial. Well, apparently in the past there have been incidents of Google providing like bad phone numbers to like scam customer service lines, and this has obviously caused issues for a lot of people because when you're calling into like a company and they say, "Oh, this is Google or whoever," you just automatically assume because you don't really have much of a way to fact check that. Google is kind of how you fact check that, so when you're given a bad number, that could easily be a way to spiral into like giving out personal information or maybe buying something you don't really want or getting scammed in some other way. She talks about another article by Kaspersky that lists 12 different internet scams and tips on how to avoid getting wrapped into like these different scams that she talks about. She also mentions, interestingly, that the top two scams were job offer scams and lottery scams, and that in order to best like avoid these job offer scams, it's best to not cash suspicious checks. She says that you can ask your bank to hold on to these funds until the check itself is verified. And then when it comes to lottery scams, it's best to not really trust these lottery emails at all, especially if you've not actually heard of these lotteries or like if you have no memory of like engaging with them in the first place. And I could say that these tips all make a lot of sense. I know scams come up quite often. I especially thought the one about not calling the phone lines provided by Google was important because nowadays we have so many different like spam filters and things like that sometimes it's like hard to think like that stuff can even still get through, but it does happen. And I know sometimes that when we do see stuff that like seems almost like scam content, at least a lot of times will just immediately kind of not directly think about it too hard because I'm used to it just being like cut out for me by like my email filter by Google or whoever. But it is still important to really think about these different things that we're seeing and consider whether or not it could be dangerous to us or whether maybe like, it is kind of authentic or if it is a scam or just, like it's important to do your research to know that what you are engaging with is real content coming from a real source and it's not something that's just meant to trip you up. I thought for sure that I could connect with Genesis's original post, and I made sure to talk about this in my comment because, we've all kind of seen scams before. If you are someone who does any kind of engaging with the internet, you've seen it before. I've gotten texts before from services pretending to be like USPS who are wanting like mail fees and they ask for like your bank numbers. And I've seen emails where they talk about job offers that do seem too good to be true. It's a matter of working like a part-time remote position and you're getting paid like dozens and dozens of dollars like per hour, and it's just like all too good to be true. And it's just, I've seen all that stuff, so I can definitely connect to these different things and I can understand why it's important to kind of protect yourself from them. And then I also wanted to compliment Genesis on her post because she did a good job of talking about multiple different scams and kind of repeating a lot of what she saw in her original articles that she read. I think in her original post she talks about at least like half a dozen, which is impressive because I think it would be easy to just talk about like 2 or 3 and give like basic overviews, but she talks about quite a few and she does a good job of like fully fleshing them all out and explaining them and giving good explanations about what they look like and how they can be harmful and how to protect yourself and like even like what scams are more common, and all just good information like that. That's really good stuff to have. So I definitely was happy to see that all kind of made its way into the post. That was cool. But basically, that was everything that I had to do for assignment number 3 for this week. Moving on to assignment number 4, this was potentially my favorite assignment throughout the whole course. I thought it was really funny. Basically, we were told to look at any source, and we were told to find one product that has received at least 3 satirical reviews on an online shopping site, such as like Amazon.com. And then after this, we were told to read through a few negative but not satirical 1-star reviews that have been left on Amazon, and these were also pretty funny. For example, the first review talks about, it's a 1-star review, and it says, "I never received it. In fact, I don't think I ordered it." And there's another one that said, "Loved it, but it was just a 1-star review." And it's just funny to look at some of these things sometimes, because it's like you could tell some of these people are not like super internet literate, so it's just kind of fun to look at and chuckle and then go on with your day. So I definitely appreciated that. But as for the discussion board, today we were tasked with identifying the product that we found, and then sharing a photo of it. And then we were supposed to find 3 different satirical reviews and then actually post them into the kind of discussion board where other classmates could look at them. So there are a few different good products on here. There are some about pickleballs, and then people joking about how like, oh, like they're great to use like in a pickle or whatever, like they're just jokes. Or there's one with like a pound of sugar-free gummy bears, and the comments are about how like you can use them as like laxatives or whatever, how they like prank their friends. Just kind of fun stuff. For my product, I found one called a pet rock, and the reviews were just, there were quite a few good ones, honestly, but they just joke about like how the rock is almost like sentient, or like they feel comforted like being with this rock because it like it's so quiet and like it listens so well, and it just like it doesn't pressure them or like like judge them or like like violate their space or anything. And like obviously it's just a rock and it's just like jokes, but it was just kind of funny like going through all these different little bits of text where people joke about like how like super great and awesome it is that like they found like their new best friend that is like a rock. It's just this pet rock, you know. But yeah, I would definitely say that was one of, if not my favorite assignments for the entirety of this course, so that was fun. But that was all of assignment 4 otherwise. For assignment 5, we meet again with our chat group, and then prior to meeting, we all watched the lecture video that the professor uploaded titled "Judgment and Decision Making on the Internet." And then we also read XKCD's comic Star Ratings to further understand the representativeness heuristic as applied to internet shopping. We also made sure to review the 3 primary decision-making heuristics by reading through a handout that was provided. In the professor's lecture video, Professor Gernsbacher talks about the 3 kind of main heuristics that we use when we're decision-making. She talks about the representative heuristic, the availability heuristic, and the anchoring and adjustment heuristic. First, she talks about the representative heuristic, and to kind of discuss this, she gives an example of an experiment that was done. An experimenter sat down participants, and she would read off these kind of descriptions of people and then ask them to determine if they were a truck driver or a professor. So for example, they would tell participants that in this hypothetical town that 90% of the population are truck drivers, with 10% being professors, and then these descriptions were read. So for the first one, the experimenter would say that Buck likes football, lives in the town he was born in, and has been divorced 3 times. Is Buck a truck driver or a professor? Or another example would be, Hank has long hair, likes to hunt, and often wears his favorite flannel jacket. Truck driver or professor? Vincent wears glasses, is clumsy, and is long-winded when he talks. Truck driver or professor? And what they found was that generally participants describe half of the descriptions as sounding like they belong to truck drivers and half as if they belong to professors, even though that doesn't really fit the initial percentage of 90 to 10 that was initially given. And the reason that these judgments are made is because we rely on our internal representativeness heuristic, which is to say that we judge someone based on, we kind of expect them to look a certain way, and when we like sort of think about the basic kind of elements of their identity, we try to fit them into these different like representations to try and kind of put a label on them and understand them, even if that's not actually accurate to who they are as a person. She likens this to how reviews are kind of utilized on the internet. She talks about how we see a product that has been ranked as 5 stars by a few people to be better than a product that has been ranked as 4 stars by many people, even though realistically, if you think about it, it's not that difficult to fake a few reviews. So the odds that this 5 star like product isn't as good, like nearly as good as they say it is like very, very likely, just because there could be a lot of kind of, like gaming the system or like fraud there. Whereas, if you see something that's ranked with 4 stars by many people, you could pretty safely assume that it is a good product and that many people have had like a good amount of satisfaction with it. So really, you should put more faith into kind of this 4 star product. Next, she talks about the availability heuristic, which is the idea that if like a certain event or kind of concept is like more salient to us, like if we think of it more readily, like it's more available to our brains, we tend to overestimate how likely it is to occur. And then she references another study, a study where participants either read a news story about a man being attacked by a shark or a news story about a man winning the lottery, and then they asked both of these groups to determine what they believed the probabilities to be that they would be attacked by a shark or win the lottery. And what they found is that groups that had read stories that were related to the questions they were asked were more likely to report that those events were more likely to occur. So in other words, like people who read stories about winning the lottery were more likely to believe that like the odds of winning the lottery were higher than they actually were. This is a good example of the availability heuristic because it kind of works on us like using recent examples or what we think we know or what we've seen to predict like what's going to happen, even though we're better off just relying on like odds and percentages that we know to be true and like what is factually correct rather than what we think is going to happen. So then she likens this to the internet, talking about how like on Facebook, a lot of times if people see pictures of like their friends having fun, like going on vacation or drinking alcohol or hanging out with friends, then they're much more likely to assume that these behaviors are common, even though realistically they're not. It's just a matter of, on the internet, people are going to post things that kind of seem more fun and like entertaining because that's what you want people to look like, even if it's not like actually accurate to your real life. And then finally, she talks about the anchoring and adjustment heuristic, which is the idea that we can be biased by like being given like a starting number called like an anchor, and that can adjust our beliefs about like how we perceive kind of future numbers. That one's kind of confusing to explain, but basically it's the idea if you tell someone, for example, that the average person has 120,000 hairs on their head, and then you ask like that person how many hairs they think they have on their head, they're probably going to say something like 120,000 and then adjust based on that. So like if they have thicker hair or thinner hair, they might say that they have more or less, based on what they believe to be true about their hair. But I mean, realistically, they don't know anything about how many hairs they have. They're just using that kind of made up fake initial number to base their answer. And this principle actually comes up a lot in sales because, I mean, if you think about like subscription plans, the first one you might see might be kind of expensive. It might be something like $10, and that might be like the basic plan where you get like simple access to like maybe you can just watch movies. But then maybe if you pay a little more, like $15, you get access to movies and television shows. And maybe if you pay like $16, you get access to movies and television. And maybe you can like get access to shows early, or you can save content to watch it later, things like that. And what they want you to do is they want you to look at that initial price of $10 and then to look at those $15 and $16 price points and realize that it's not much more. And they want you to feel like you have an easier time kind of buying into those things because it, like, quote unquote, doesn't cost that much. When in reality, if maybe that initial plan costs like less, like $5, then you might be looking at those other plans and thinking, well, $15 to $16 a month is still like a decent amount of money. I don't want to pay that much. But because you were kind of shown that initial price point of 10, you might just step up from there and say, well, 5 or 6 more a month really isn't that much. So that's why you kind of see it pretty often in like sales related purposes. It can be used to kind of make price points seem better or worse. And then the other readings, like the comic that we talked about, which looked about star ratings, was kind of similar to what I talked about with like the representative heuristic. And then the third reading which was made specifically for this class, also just talks more about the representative availability and then anchoring and adjustment heuristics. And then during our actual group chat, we were expected to take all three of those heuristics and talk about how they could exist in response to like specifically internet use and how they could kind of exist in a sense off the internet, kind of similarly to what I talked about with the different experiments that were run and how that affects like how we buy things and how we like engage with content or rate restaurants, things like that, all the stuff that I was previously talking about. And then finally, as a group, we were expected to brainstorm an additional internet use example for each of the three primary decision-making heuristics. First, we talked about how a lot of times in real estate, they'll use the anchoring principle. So for example, when like your real estate agent is showing you homes to buy, the first one that they show you might be like a really unimpressive but kind of expensive home. Like they want you to look at it and think that it's not that good, because then after that, anytime they show you a house, you're going to think back to that first one you saw. Like this new one that you're seeing is just like so much better. It's so much cleaner and it's so much nicer in regards to that first one. And then next, for an example for the availability heuristic, we talked about how generally, like if you hear about how there's been a plane crash in the news recently, you might be more likely to assume like that in the near future. Like if you fly, you're going to be in a plane crash, or you might be more hesitant to get on a plane at all. Even though obviously one plane crash doesn't like change the odds of a plane crash happening, but it still would like freak people out and make them feel like they're unsafe, even though like nothing has changed really enough in the procedure or whatnot to actually increase the odds of you getting in a plane crash. And then for the representative heuristic, we talked about how a lot of times social media pages will make college specifically like look a lot crazier than it really is. I mean, you see a lot of posts about how like different kind of groups of people are drinking or what like the bars look like. And it might seem like college is just this big crazy thing. But the reality of it is that, it's Friday night and it's Saturday night. And maybe it's like a little bit here and there on other days. But I mean, really, you spend like 90% of your time working or sleeping, like it's a matter of getting your job done and keeping yourself alive. Partying is kind of, it's not the first thing that you do, and it's not the second, and it's not the third. But social media kind of betrays that thought because it feels like a lot of times that's all you ever really see on there. Anyways, that was the end of our group meet, so we kind of split up our responsibilities for the meet, and then we picked our next time to meet as well. And that was the end of assignment 5. And then for assignment 6, we can jump right away into the Unit 10 course review. We were expected to list the 3 primary decision-making heuristics and give an example of how each applies to internet use. So I talked about the representative heuristic and how the ratings and reviews that we see for restaurants are what we consider the restaurant to be like, even though the reviews we see are likely biased in some way. And then for the availability heuristic, I talked about how we see the posts that people make on social media and assume that is what their lives are always like, even though that is certainly not the case, and that they probably have boring, slang lives and days just like everyone else. And then for the anchoring or adjusting heuristic, I talked about how when we shop online, we look for deals, and we often base our feelings of what good and bad deals are based on what we've previously seen. So like a cheap shirt might just really be something that costs more than like 4 other shirts that we've already seen, even though it might not objectively be a cheap shirt. Like $15 might feel like cheap because every other shirt we saw was $30, but 15 might still not be cheap depending on who you ask. I personally think that is not cheap. I would pay less for a shirt because I don't know. I feel like shirts are so expensive, man. It's crazy. Getting just a nice shirt with a basic decal on it, but whatever. That's another thing. Don't worry about that. But yeah, then it was just a matter of kind of doing more podcast work for Unit 10, keeping up with my journal, and then like taking screenshots of my work, and then writing my 200-word summary about what I've done and what I'm going to do, and just throwing it all together and, uploading it all for Unit 10 Assignment 6. And with that being said, that was the end of Unit 10.